In my experience, believers hate nothing more than the burden of proof, and that's why they try to redefine what evidence means so that it is no longer a fact that indicates. Because they can't give you any facts, not to point their way, so they give arguments instead of evidence, essentially word games trying to define their God into existence, with erroneous or fallacious assumptions built into most of them. If you ever look at a list of logical fallacies, you might notice that every one of them has been used as an argument for God. And in my experience, every argument for God involves at least one logical fallacy and usually more than one. And as I'm sure we will both demonstrate in our upcoming discussion, at which time I will claim that as one of many facts and evidence in my case against God. Of course, the first fact in evidence against God is that there is no evidence for God. We have to start there because logically, having no reason to believe something is a pretty good reason not to believe it, especially when such is neither probable nor even possible. We don't get to say that anything is possible because we know too many things that are not. A cow cannot jump over the moon, for example. That's not just improbable, that's physically impossible. In order to say whether something is possible, there must be a precedent or parallel or verified phenomenon indicating that such possibility exists. You don't have that for gods or ghosts or demons or souls or for magical enchantments like blessings or curses. So not only is none of that evident, it's not even a possibility to consider. Believers can't even give a consistent definition of what their God is supposed to be. Neuroscientists understand the mind to be an emergent property of the brain. So the notion of a disembodied mind is nonsense, as Jake just pointed out himself. And it's contradicted by Scripture as well, because while modern theologians have contrived some lofty exaggerations of what they've built their God up to be, let's not forget God's humble beginnings in ancient mythology. The Bible tells us that God walks, talks, eats, turns his head, waves his hand, shows his backside, and cheats at wrestling. It says that Adam, Abraham, and Moses all spoke to God face to face, and that 70 of the elders of Israel were allowed to look upon God in physical form. But whether God has a body or not, there's no explanation given for how this God even could exist, much less how it does anything. And the sacred fables all say ridiculous things, like how he created the first man with a golem spell, while he created everything else with an incantation, speaking everything out of nothing, abracadabra, just like so many pagan gods did, like the Native American god Coyote, who made the mountains and the rivers and who put the salmon into the rivers. There's no explanation for how he made or put anything or how gods do anything. It's all a process of PFM, better known as pure fucking magic. Then there's the fact that it doesn't matter which faith we focus on. No religion can show that they're any more accurate than every other faith. The same goes for their scriptures, too. The Jewish Torah, the Christian Gospels, the Quran of Islam, the Kitab-i-Aqdas of Baha'u'llah, the Avestas of Zarathustra, the Adi Granth of the Sikhs, the Hindu Vedas and the Mahabharata's Bhagavad Gita, the Book of Mormon, and the Urantia book have all been declared by some devotees to be the absolute truth and the revealed word of the one true God, even when they can't agree on who or what that God is. Everyone knows that every word of all these supposedly sacred tomes was scribbled by scribes, mere fallible men who obviously had no idea what they were talking about, because every supposedly God-breathed doctrine is full of errors. For example, everything the Bible or the Quran says about the Earth in relation to the rest of the cosmos is flat Earth cosmology from the Iron Age. So they couldn't have been written or given or dictated by any gods or angels because they would have known better. We have sufficient evidence in science to prove that Adam and Eve are genetically impossible and were not real people. The global population cannot have been derived from a single couple, not 6,000 years ago, nor even 600,000 years ago. We descend from a particular population of apes, numbering several thousand strong at least, who set out on the road to our lineage at least a few million years ago. To be clear, this is a matter of objectively demonstrable scientific fact, not assumptions. Physical anthropologists and paleoprimatologists can show how humans and chimpanzees share a common ancestry is an objectively verifiable fact in the absolute sense that it doesn't change, meaning that it will not be corrected by new information. It's not just a probability, it's a certainty. Cultural anthropologists can also show how we know that the tale of the Garden of Eden is nothing more than a fable composed of several tropes and characters showing the apparent influence of elder religions in neighboring regions. It's only possible truth depends on metaphorical interpretations. There is absolutely no truth in any part of that story otherwise. Archaeologists assure us that the same goes for the Tower of Babel and even the Exodus. Historians agree that Moses never existed. He was a legendary character, but he wasn't real. Then paleontologists, geologists, geneticists, and practically any other earth and life scientist can disprove the global flood of Noah's Ark. The Bible and the Quran both imply that this was a global event, flooding the whole world, and that everyone alive today is a descendant of Noah. But we have literally tons of rock-solid proof from many independent fields of study that it's just a story. It never happened, not the way it says in anyone's scriptures. It's not just that it couldn't have happened, but even if it could have, by some flurry of miracles, we still have an overwhelming preponderance of evidence to prove that it didn't happen. So the Bible and the Quran are both wrong, not just about that, but practically everything else of importance too. It's not just that all the scriptures are laughably wrong about practically everything, scientifically and historically, ethically and morally. It's that outside of these assorted doctrines, we see that the fact that belief in any God doesn't have any apparent impact on the person's morality. Instead, and even worse, there are criminal studies showing that the more religious one is, the more likely they are to be bigoted, intolerant, and abusive, favoring violent vengeance over rehabilitation or restitution. Comparative analysis of child molesters even decades ago showed that statistically, the more religious an abuser is, the more abusive they were, with more and younger victims. Whereas programs like the Clergy Project reveal that when people stop believing, they become more tolerant, more curious, liberal, less bigoted, and judgmental. And why are so many people leaving religion? Because of the fact that all the world's religions combined can't even show that there's a there, that there is anything supernatural at all. There's no discernible, verifiable truth to any supernatural claims, just subjective impressions and baseless assumptions. Any claim of facts in evidence of the divine or of anything supernatural always turn out to be nothing but frauds, falsehoods, and fallacies, which ought to matter to you if the truth matters to you at all, if you want to understand knowledge as distinguished from make-believe. Yet all the major religions require faith instead, where you're supposed to believe whatever they said simply because they said so. I think all of us would agree that faith healers and self-described exorcists are famously fraudulent, yet we ignore that Jesus was running the same game as they are, just another superstitious cult leader. The people who have dedicated decades of their lives to the study of near-death experiences have lost faith even in that, coming away admitting that there's still no substance to it after all this time, over half a century, and there's still very few cases without a clear explanation. That's not what they predicted 50 years ago. And the failure there, according to all of the neuroscientists, neurophilosophers, and brain surgeons I've spoke to, is the fact that there's no support for mind-body dualism, neither in neuroscience nor even in philosophy. It's not just that there's no evidence right where it should be, right where it would be if we had an animating immortal spirit. It's that we have so much evidence against it to confidently conclude that we don't have souls. Without an immortal supernatural soul, there can't be an afterlife, thus no heaven or hell, and without them, the notion of a God is largely moot. This doesn't make a lot of difference in Islam, since the Quran talks about a physical heaven, where our bodies will be reanimated such that we will still require food, even in hell, where roughly 80% of the world would spend eternity if Islam was correct. Unfortunately, Islam is not correct. There is no hell, and God doesn't operate an invisible hotel in the expanse of the non-existent firmament either. Regardless what God or religion it is, hell is inconsistent with God. If there was a God, there still wouldn't be a hell, because no God would allow it. If we are to believe what the scriptures say about God being infinitely merciful and just, those two are already in contradiction with each other, and both contradict the description of God as a righteous judge, having wisdom or love or any of that, which contradicts everything required to torture everyone mercilessly, relentlessly, forever and ever over a thought crime. The Quran repeatedly says that simply believing equals doing good and that not believing equals doing evil. So Islam is just like Christianity in that we are not judged on morality, but on gullibility, because we are judged and damned forever over what or whether we believed. Hell would still be grossly unjust even if we knew God existed, but as you've seen here today, we have not given evidence to compel belief, so hell becomes exponentially worse. No God would want or allow something so petty and vindictive. And such is obviously just an excuse that theologians made up so that those who didn't believe in the impossible promise of a posthumous reward might believe in the threat of a fate worse than death if they don't believe. For the purpose, of course, being the manipulation of the masses toward the ultimate goal of enriching and empowering the clergy. This is only circumstantial evidence against God, but it's worth mentioning. This is especially bad in Islam because the Quran says a few times that God decides who will believe and who won't. So we don't even have free will. Instead, we submit to God's will as if we were just his playthings and he's going to punish us for whatever he forced us to do. Thus, belief in God is inconsistent with both free will and objective morality, which is a contradiction of two of the most popular reasons believers cite for why they believe and why we should believe. And note that their most popular reasons for believing have nothing to do with evidence. Again, as always, belief is assumed in lieu of evidence and maintained despite all evidence to the contrary. Evidence is a body of facts, objectively verifiable data indicating one conclusion or eliminating another. If the truth is what the facts are, then there is no significant or spiritual truth in any religious doctrine, but there are a hell of a lot of lies in all of them. Thus, we have nothing at all to imply that there even could be a God, but ample evidence everywhere to show that God is a fantasy, phantasm, nothing more than wishful thinking. The holy doctrines of the various religions remain the only source of information of who or what God is supposed to be, and they violently contradict each other. This is another fact against God. Each of these tomes is individually full of absurdities and atrocities, inconsistencies and contradictions, so that none of the authors of these myths and legends actually knows what they're talking about. Nearly anything any of the scriptures says falls into one of two categories. It's either not evidently true, meaning that there's no evidence for it, or it's evidently not true, meaning it's already been shown to be false. The fact that the Bible and Quran and all of the rest of this man-made mythology even exists in such defective, conflicting condition is evidence against God, who should have corrected all that. And despite all attempts at philosophical rationalization, there is no actual factual evidence of God outside of Scripture either, literally not even a possibility to consider. The claim that an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving creator God exists is logically inconsistent and paradoxical due to the presence of suffering in the world, in a world that is, as Darwin described it, red in tooth and claw. The persistent existence of such a level of suffering throughout the Earth's history, as well as the extent of that history, remains in conflict with the attributes attributed to such a God. Moreover, considering the lack of logically coherent, verifiable evidence for the existence of the Abrahamic God specifically, it is reasonable to conclude that the claims of such deity are just a myth. It is essential to adhere to the fundamental principles of logic, which necessitate evidence and demonstrability when affirming the truth of a claim. Holding an absolute positive belief in anything, let alone something that lacks reliably verifiable proof, violates these principles. Rendering the claim of an Abrahamic God is not only a myth, but a baseless speculation, having no more credence than a claim that has already been proven false. Very often, believers may already know that there's no evidence of God or anything supernatural, but they're determined to make believe in it anyway for reasons that don't qualify as reason. So they have to find a way to shift the burden of proof onto the negative claim or onto someone who doesn't believe in their unsupported assertions of illogical, irrational, impossible absurdity. I mean, it should be that if you make a claim, you have to substantiate it or be dismissed and discredited for stating falsehoods. But faith is the most dishonest position it is possible to have because claiming facts that aren't facts and pretending to know things you don't know is what faith is all about. But in every other application, we would call that lying. The only way that faith could be any less honest or any more dishonest is if you're a religious apologist. Asserting speculation without reason and defending it against all reason is what apologetics is all about, making up any and all excuses to justify doctrinal errors and or to systematically dismiss or ignore any and all evidence against an a priori belief, to defend the faith even in those instances where you know it's not true. So they resort to an appeal to ignorance, as if they can assert whatever they want without any justification at all. We saw that tonight, and they think that they can refer to such lies as the absolute truth until or unless we can prove it false. Then apologists will still call it truth, even after it's been thoroughly disproved, because faith means never admitting when you're wrong. Because of one of the problems with a faith-based belief system is that there are required beliefs and prohibited beliefs where you're forbidden to admit certain truths that that may call the faith into question because you have to believe a particular interpretation of doctrine no matter what, or else face the empty threat of eternal damnation. Additionally, there's usually an emotional attachment to certain faith beliefs, an often culturally conditioned, deep-seated need to believe that overrides our natural desire to understand. In either case, it means that the believer has to come up with some excuse, any excuse to keep on believing even when they know it's not true, as has happened a few times. People have admitted to me that they know it's not true, but they're going to believe it anyway. So they make up arguments instead of evidence, arguments that all require specific assumptions and typically depend on false dichotomy, where only two options are allowed and no others may be admitted, because the goal is not to seek the truth, but to avoid uncomfortable truths in defense of the faith. My problem is, and this is sincere, this is my problem, I can't relate to this. I can't choose to believe whatever I want to, especially when it's apparently indefensible, when there is no truth to it. The difference in our positions is that I want to know whatever the truth is, regardless what I might rather believe, whereas the faithful just want to believe whatever they want to, regardless what the truth is. Judging by several admissions I've heard, these so-called true believers apparently don't even care what the truth is. They want to make believe something else instead.